The wind in Red Bluff Valley had teeth. It was a high plains wind, born on the snow caps of the distant mountains and sharpened on the endless miles of rock and scrub. It carried the fine red dust that gave the valley its name, dusting the silvery bark of the cypress trees until they looked like they were bleeding. From his vantage point on the ridge, Nathaniel Cole watched that wind whip across the expanse of his newest acquisition, Willow Creek Ranch. It sprawled below him, a patchwork of brown pasture and gray scrub, bisected by the dark, life-giving thread of the creek itself. He had not bought it for its beauty, though there was a stark, unforgiving sort of beauty to it. He had bought it for the water, after a year of drought and a vicious cattle plague had broken the previous owner. Nathaniel had swept in. His money, earned not from the soil but from the iron rails of the Union Pacific and lucrative government beef contracts, spoke a language everyone understood. This ranch was a key. It held the most reliable water source in 3 counties and offered a straight, defensible path for driving his herds to the rail spur he planned to build. It was a strategic asset, a piece on a chessboard that stretched across Wyoming. It was not a home. He had long ago decided he had no need for one of those. His friend and foreman, Boyd, shifted in his saddle beside him, a big man with a quiet disposition. Boyd understood Nathaniel better than most. He knew the purchase was not about pride or adding another pin to a map. It was about control. Control over the land, over the market, and, most importantly, over himself. I am done with entanglements, Nathaniel thought, the wind tugging at the brim of his hat. He had learned his lesson years ago, learned it in a perfumed parlor back east. He had offered a woman his heart, and she had weighed it against the fortune of a man whose father had more money than his own. The choice had been swift and simple for her. For him, it had been a final closing of a door. He had come west to build an empire of cattle and steel, a fortress so high no one could ever reach the man inside. This ranch was just another stone in the wall. Down in the small, wind-scoured town of Red Bluff, the same news that solidified Nathaniel's control was stirring the pot in the copper cup. The coffee shop was the town's warm, beating heart, a haven from the biting wind and the even more biting gossip. It smelled of roasting coffee beans, charcoal smoke, and Martha's cinnamon buns. Eliza Hart moved through the familiar space with a practiced, if sometimes clumsy, grace. A dropped spoon, a slight overfill of a cup. These were common occurrences, but they were always followed by such a genuinely apologetic blush that no one ever minded. She was refilling the sugar bowl when the door swung open, admitting a gust of red dust and 2 ranchers who stamped their boots loudly on the welcome mat. "Baron Cole has done it," one of them announced to the room at large. "He bought Willow Creek, lock, stock, and barrel." A low murmur went through the dozen or so patrons. Eliza felt a familiar tightening in her stomach. Men with that much money were like weather fronts. They changed everything, and you could do little but brace for their arrival. She kept her eyes down, polishing a clean spot on the counter. "Heard he paid in gold coin," another man added, his voice full of awe. "Just like that. Did not even dicker." Eliza winced. She hated the way people spoke of money, as if it were a god. Her foster mother, Martha, resting in the small room at the back of the shop, needed a doctor from Cheyenne, a doctor who cost money. Eliza worked from before dawn until after dusk to keep the copper cup afloat, to afford the medicine that eased Martha's cough, to ensure they had a roof over their heads. She understood the necessity of money, but she despised the worship of it, and she especially disliked men who used it like a club to beat the world into submission. Across the room, Mayor Silas Dugan lowered his newspaper, his lips pursed in a thoughtful, predatory smile, as the town's banker and its mayor. Dugan's thoughts were never far from profit and influence. "Well now," he said smoothly, his voice gliding over the excited chatter, "that is interesting news indeed. Willow Creek's water rights are extensive, A man who controls that water controls the whole valley. He caught Eliza's eye and gave her a small, oily nod. Eliza felt her cheeks flush and quickly looked away. She knew that look. It was the look of a man who saw everything, including her, as something to be appraised and potentially acquired. They call her Virgin Heart. The cowboys would joke when she was out of earshot. Though, she always heard, the nickname was a strange mixture of mockery and respect. She was past 20, yet she carried an air of innocence that was both genuine and a fiercely guarded shield. She blushed at coarse jokes, refused to serve men who were too deep in their cups, and had never, not once, accepted a gift or a lingering touch from any of the lonely men who passed through Red Bluff. Her dignity was her armor, and in a world where a woman alone was often seen as a commodity, it was the most valuable thing she owned. The bell over the door chimed again. Deputy Alma Reyes stepped inside, bringing a sense of calm authority with her. She was a sharp, observant woman whose family had been in this territory long before it was called Wyoming. Her dark eyes missed nothing. She gave a nod to the room and made her way to the counter. "Sounds like we have a new king in the valley," Alma said quietly to Eliza, her voice low and steady. Eliza managed a small smile. "Just another man with a big hat and a bigger purse, I suppose." Alma's gaze drifted to Mayor Dugan, who was now holding court, explaining the legal intricacies of water ownership to the ranchers. "Be careful, Eliza. Men like Cole do not get that rich by being simple, and men like Dugan do not like competition. That water is going to be trouble. I can feel it." As if to punctuate her words, the name of another kind of trouble was spoken at Dugan's table. "Wonder what Jack Crow will make of this," a rancher mused aloud. "A herd as big as Cole's is a mighty tempting target for a rustler." Dugan waved a dismissive hand, but his eyes were hard. "Jack Crow is a nuisance, not a threat to a man like Nathaniel Cole. Still, he will bear watching." Eliza poured Alma a cup of coffee, her hand steady despite the unease settling over her. A new baron, a scheming mayor, a band of rustlers. It felt as if the fragile peace of their valley was about to be torn apart by the ambitions of powerful men. All she wanted was to keep this small corner of the world safe for Martha, to earn an honest living, and to be left alone. Later that afternoon, a shadow fell across the doorway. Nathaniel Cole and Boyd stepped into the copper cup. The low hum of conversation did not just quiet. It ceased entirely. Every eye in the room turned to the man who had, in a single transaction, become the most powerful figure in their lives. He was taller than Eliza had imagined, broad-shouldered from a life in the saddle, but he did not carry himself with the swagger she expected. His face was hard, carved by wind and sun, and his eyes, a startlingly clear gray, swept the room with a cool, assessing glance. They were the eyes of a man who missed nothing and valued little. He was not looking at the people. He was evaluating the room itself, its sturdy timbers, its layout, its exits. He and Boyd took a small table in the corner. Eliza felt her heart begin to beat a little faster. This was him, the Baron, the man who bought ranches without dickering. She took a deep breath, smoothed her apron, and walked toward their table, her footsteps sounding unnaturally loud in the silent room. "What can I get for you, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. Boyd grunted. "Coffee, black." Nathaniel's gray eyes finally settled on her. For a moment, his gaze was so direct, so penetrating, that she felt her blush rise like a fever. He was not looking at her the way other men did, with hunger or flirtation. He was looking at her like she was a puzzle, a detail that did not quite fit the picture. She saw the weariness etched around his eyes, the tension in his jaw. This was not just a rich man. This was a tired man, a man carrying a weight far heavier than his gold. "The same," he said, his voice a low baritone. She nodded and retreated to the safety of her counter, her hands fumbling slightly as she filled 2 heavy ceramic mugs. The entire cafe watched her, watched him, She could feel their collective breath being held. She carried the mugs back to the table, placing them carefully on the wooden surface, trying not to spill a drop. He took a sip, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up at her again. "Good coffee," he stated. It was not a compliment. It was a fact, an assessment. "Thank you, sir." He drank the rest in silence, his gaze fixed on the street outside the window, already planning, calculating. Boyd finished his own cup and the two men stood to leave. As they did, Nathaniel reached into his waistcoat and pulled out a gold coin. It was a $20 eagle, a fortune. It was more than she made in a month. He placed it on the table. It gleamed against the dark wood. A small, arrogant sun. Eliza stared at it. It was a payment. Yes, but it was also a statement, a demonstration of power, a way of saying, "I can afford to be careless with amounts that would change your life." It was everything she despised. The entire room was watching. She could feel Dugan's smirk without even looking at him. She felt the weight of their poverty, their deference to this man's wealth. And in that moment, a quiet, stubborn resolve hardened within her. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked up the coin. It was heavy. She held it out to him. Her voice was barely a whisper, but in the silent room, it carried like a gunshot. "The coffee is a dime. Sir, for two, that is 20 cents. Nathaniel turned back, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. He looked from the coin in her hand to her flushed, determined face. He had used money to solve every problem, to open every door, to quiet every complaint for a decade. He could not recall the last time anyone had refused it. "Keep the change," he said, his tone clipped. "I cannot," she insisted, her chin lifting. "It is not right, please. Just the 20 cents. For a long moment, they stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills. The richest man in Wyoming and a clumsy coffee server with nothing to her name but her own integrity. His cold, hard power against her quiet, unyielding dignity. A muscle worked in his jaw. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, he saw not a servant or a woman, but a person whose values could not be bought. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a quarter. He took it and placed it in her outstretched hand, his fingers briefly brushing hers. Her skin was warm. He then took the gold coin from her and slid it back into his waistcoat. Without another word, he turned and strode out of the copper cup, Boyd following in his wake. The room erupted in hushed, frantic whispers. Eliza stood perfectly still, the quarter clutched in her hand. Her face was on fire, but her heart was calm. She had met the Baron, the king of the valley, and she had not bowed. She had not sold a single piece of herself. Outside, the red wind howled, but inside the small cafe, a quiet warmth held its ground. The question lingered in the air, unspoken but felt by everyone. What good is it to be the richest man in the valley, if your heart is the coldest? The notice appeared on the town hall bulletin board the next morning, written in a clerk's precise, impersonal hand. It was a declaration, cold and absolute. Nathaniel Cole, the new owner of Willow Creek Ranch, was exercising his legal right, as detailed in the original land grant and deed, to dam the creek and divert the water for the exclusive use of his property. The legal language was ironclad, citing statutes and precedents that no one in Red Bluff had ever bothered to read. The meaning, however, was as clear as the creek water itself. The spigot was being turned off. For Nathaniel, it was a simple matter of logistics. To sustain a herd of his size and prepare for the new rail spur, he needed absolute control of his resources. The document was not an act of aggression. It was an act of efficiency. He gave no thought to the smaller ranches downstream, the homesteads that relied on the seasonal overflow, the families who had built their lives around the assumption that the water, like the sky above it, belonged to everyone. Silas Dugan read the notice not with anger, but with a deep, satisfying sense of opportunity. He spent the day in his bank, behind a polished oak desk, receiving a steady stream of worried ranchers. To each, his face was a mask of sympathy. "It is a terrible thing. John," he would say, leaning forward with feigned sincerity. "A man from the East comes in with railroad money and forgets how a community works." When they asked for extensions on their loans, citing the impending lack of water for their own small herds, Dugan's tone would shift. His sympathy remained, but it was now tinged with the hard reality of finance. "The bank wants to help, of course, but these are uncertain times. An investment without a guaranteed water source is risky. I can extend your note, but I'm afraid the interest will have to be adjusted to reflect that new risk." One by one, they left his office with their heads bowed. The chains of debt pulled a little tighter around their necks. Dugan had not created the crisis, but he was a master at leveraging one. He was turning the rancher's fear into a weapon, aiming it squarely at Nathaniel Cole. That evening, a bone-deep chill settled over the valley, the kind that promised the first snow of the season. Eliza was in the alley behind the copper cup, emptying the day's coffee grounds onto the small compost heap. The darkness was thick, broken only by a sliver of moon. It was then she heard the voices, low and conspiratorial, from the other side of the dividing fence. "It must be an accident," one voice said. "It was Silas Dugan's, smooth and venomous. No one can be blamed for an act of God, or a moment of carelessness." A rougher voice grumbled in response. "Accidents cost money." Eliza froze, her hand still on the bucket. She recognized the second voice as belonging to Jack Crow, a man whose reputation was as foul as the cheap whiskey he drank. "Consider it an investment in the community's future," Dugan purred. "A man building a dam in this weather, with winter coming on so fast. Well, it is a treacherous business. A stray spark, a faulty support. So many things could go wrong. It would be a terrible shame." There was a heavy clinking sound, like coins being poured into a leather pouch. "I will see what I can do about preventing such a tragedy from completing," Crow said, his voice thick with greed. The footsteps faded into the darkness. Eliza stood trembling, not from the cold, but from the chilling certainty of what she had just overheard. It was not just a business dispute over water. It was something far more dangerous. The snow began 2 days later. It started as a flurry, a gentle dusting, but by morning, a full-blown blizzard had descended, driven by the relentless high plains wind. Red Bluff huddled under a thick white blanket. From the window of the copper cup, Eliza watched a team of loggers hired by Nathaniel trudge through the deepening drifts on their way to Willow Creek. They were men she knew, fathers and sons from town, their faces grim and their shoulders hunched against the biting cold. They were working because they needed the wages, blizzard or not. A familiar ache of compassion stirred in her. Martha was asleep in the back, her breathing a soft, shallow rasp. Eliza looked at the large pot of coffee steaming on the stove. It was an impulsive thought, born of a simple, uncalculated kindness. She found the largest insulated thermos they owned, filled it to the brim, and grabbed a stack of tin cups. Bundling herself in her thickest wool coat and shawl, she told a neighbor to listen for Martha and stepped out into the storm. The walk to the ranch was a battle. The wind tore at her, and the snow soaked the hem of her dress. By the time she saw the work site, a raw gash in the landscape where men were struggling with frozen timbers and icy ropes. She was half frozen herself. She saw Nathaniel before he saw her. He was not overseeing from a distance. He was in the thick of it, his expensive coat covered in snow, his voice sharp and clear as he directed the placement of a heavy beam. He moved with a restless energy, pushing himself as hard as he pushed his men. For a fleeting moment, Eliza saw past the Baron. She saw a man consumed by his own ambition, a man whose drive left no room for warmth or rest. He was on horseback, urging the animal across a slick, icy patch near the creek bed. It happened in an instant. The horse's hooves went out from under it with a terrified whinny. Nathaniel was thrown, landing with a sickening thud on the frozen ground. The men cried out and rushed to his side. Eliza, her heart pounding, ran forward, the heavy thermos clutched in her hands. Boyd was kneeling beside him. "He is conscious. His wrist, I think." Nathaniel was sitting up, his face pale and tight with pain, cradling his left wrist. It was already beginning to swell. Eliza knelt in the snow beside him, her own discomfort forgotten. "Let me see," she said, her voice gentle but firm. She set the thermos down and reached for his arm. He flinched, his gray eyes locking on her with surprise. "I know a little about sprains," she said, not waiting for permission. "My mother, Martha, she falls sometimes." She carefully probed the wrist, her touch surprisingly confident. "It is not broken, I do not think, but it is a bad sprain. It needs to be wrapped tightly." From a small satchel she always carried, she produced a clean linen bandage and a small wooden splint. The men watched in silence as she worked, her movements deft and focused. She supported his arm, her expression a mixture of concentration and compassion. He did not speak, merely watched her, his breath frosting in the frigid air. The scent of coffee from the nearby thermos mixed with the smell of pine and wet wool. In the midst of the cold, chaotic work site, it was a small pocket of warmth and unexpected care. When she was finished, the bandage was snug, the splint secure. "There," she said, pulling her hands back. "You must keep it still and get out of this cold." He flexed his fingers, his jaw tight. He looked from his bandaged wrist to her face, her cheeks red from the cold. A few snowflakes caught in her dark hair. A strange, unfamiliar feeling stirred in his chest. It was a disorienting blend of gratitude and confusion. This was not a transaction. He had offered her nothing. He reached inside his coat with his good hand, his movements automatic. He pulled out a gold coin, the same kind he had offered her in the cafe. "For your time, doctor," he said, his voice strained. Eliza looked at the coin, then back at his tired, pained face. She shook her head, a small, sad smile touching her lips. She pushed the thermos of coffee toward him. "I came to bring coffee for the men," she said softly. "I will take payment for the coffee. I will not take gold for helping a man who is hurt. That is not something for sale." She stood, brushing the snow from her skirt. The loggers were already gathering around the thermos, pouring the steaming black liquid into tin cups, their hands wrapped around the warmth. Their quiet words of thanks were all the payment she needed. Nathaniel stared at his bandaged wrist, then at the woman who had tended to it. For the second time, she had refused his money. She had offered him something else, something he had not encountered in a very long time, genuine, unprompted kindness. He was the Baron, a man who commanded an army of workers and controlled the fate of the valley. And in that moment, he felt utterly and completely disarmed. By the time Eliza returned to town, the story had already arrived, twisted and malformed by gossip. She was chasing the Baron. She had thrown herself at him. She was using her innocent act to trap the richest man in the territory. Alma found her in the copper cup, her cheeks still flushed from the cold and the exertion. "Your trip to Willow Creek is the talk of the town," the deputy said, her expression serious. "I brought the men some coffee." Eliza said simply, "They were freezing." "I know what you did," Alma said, "but others will see what they want to see. Dugan is stirring the pot, telling everyone Cole is starving them of water while his little sweetheart brings him breakfast. Be careful. Eliza, you are standing between two very powerful, very stubborn men. A blizzard is dangerous, but not as dangerous as this." Later that day, Silas Dugan paid a visit to Willow Creek. He found Nathaniel in the Spartan ranch house, his arm in a sling, staring into a fire. Dugan oozed false concern. "Nathaniel, my boy, I heard about your accident. This valley can be a treacherous place for a man on his own." "I am not on my own," Nathaniel said, his voice flat. "Of course not," Dugan said, smiling. "But you are trying to do too much. A project this large requires partnerships, alliances, my bank, your resources. We could tame this land together. We could control everything, an offer of shared power, of a throne for two." Nathaniel turned his head and fixed Dugan with a look as cold as the ice on the creek. "I do not need partners, Dugan, and if I did, I would not choose a snake. Now, if you would excuse me, my wrist hurts." Dugan's smile vanished. The pretense was over. "Very well. Cole, you will find that winter in Red Bluff can be very cold indeed, especially for a man who has made no friends." That night, the blizzard reached its peak. The wind shrieked around the eaves of the small buildings in town and howled across the open plains. In Alma's office, she lit a lamp and looked over a report she had requested from the sheriff in the next county. It was a list of materials stolen from the Red Mountain mining concern a month prior. Her eyes scanned the mundane list of tools and supplies until one item made her pause. She circled it with a pencil. 1 crate, black Viper fuse wire, a specialized, waterproof fuse. Notoriously reliable. She knew for a fact that the largest investor in the Red Mountain mine was Silas Dugan's bank. At that same moment, a figure bundled against the storm moved like a shadow through the swirling snow at Willow Creek. He crouched behind the half-finished earthworks of the dam, the roar of the wind and the groaning of the timbers covering his sounds. From a heavy oilcloth bag, he carefully removed a bundle of dynamite sticks, bound together with wire. His gloved fingers, surprisingly nimble in the cold, worked quickly, expertly placing the charge into a crevice at the base of the main support beam. He then uncoiled a length of dark, waxy fuse. He did not need a lamp to see the brand stamped on its casing. He knew it well. It was a black Viper. The dynamite was discovered at dawn. Boyd found it, his face a grim mask in the pale, cold light. The black Viper fuse was a dead giveaway, a professional's tool. Nathaniel looked at the charge, then at the groaning, half-frozen timbers of his dam, and felt not fear, but a cold, clarifying rage. The blizzard had been a cover. Dugan was not content to squeeze him with interest rates. He was willing to spill blood. There was no time to finish the main dam. His herd, thousands strong, was already low on water, penned in and restless. To hesitate was to lose them. "We dig a bypass," Nathaniel announced, his voice cutting through the biting wind. "A temporary channel. Get every man you can find. We work until it is done." His injured wrist throbbed, a dull, constant reminder of his vulnerability. But he ignored it. Weakness was a luxury he could not afford. For the next 3 days, Willow Creek Ranch was a hive of frantic activity. Men worked in shifts around the clock, their breath misting in the frigid air, the rhythmic scrape and thud of shovels against the hard earth a constant drumbeat. The sun was a weak disk in a gray sky, offering no warmth. Nathaniel was a whirlwind of motion, everywhere at once, directing, correcting, working alongside his men, his good hand raw, his face etched with exhaustion. He was trying to bend the land to his will through sheer force, fighting a war on 2 fronts, one against the coming winter, the other against the silent, smiling enemy in town. From the window of the Copper Cup, Eliza watched the men stream in and out of Red Bluff, their face caked with mud, their eyes hollow with fatigue. They would buy coffee, their hands shaking too much to hold the cup steady, and gulp it down before heading back out into the cold. She saw the cost of Nathaniel Cole's ambition, but she also saw the simple desperation of men trying to earn a wage to feed their families. Her heart ached for them. Martha, propped up with pillows in her chair by the stove, watched Eliza's troubled expression. "They are good men," she said, her voice thin but clear. "But a cold belly makes for a poor worker." The idea took root. It was not about Nathaniel Cole or his cattle. It was about the men. The next morning, Eliza loaded up a small wagon with a large cast-iron stew pot, sacks of potatoes and carrots, and a side of bacon. She enlisted the help of Mr. Wu, the town's laundryman, and a surprisingly gifted tailor. "A full stomach works better," he said with a wise nod, packing a box with needles and heavy thread. "But a mended coat keeps the wind out. A fair trade, a hot meal for a bit of mending." They set up their makeshift kitchen just beyond the chaos of the digging. The fragrant steam of the stew, a stark contrast to the smell of cold mud and sweat. At first, the men were hesitant, suspicious of a kindness that came with no price tag. But hunger soon won out. They came, one by one, and Eliza filled their bowls. While they ate, Mr. Wu sat on an overturned crate, expertly stitching rips in their coats and reinforcing seams. Martha, bundled in blankets, directed the seasoning of the stew, her presence a quiet, matriarchal blessing on the entire operation. Eliza found her voice in that field kitchen. She was no longer just the clumsy girl who blushed. She was a provider, an organizer. She teased the men into smiling, listened to their worries about their families, and made sure each one had a second helping. She was building something intangible, something Nathaniel Cole with all his gold could never buy, a small pocket of community, of shared warmth in the face of hardship. Back in town, Silas Dugan was building something else entirely. He moved through the general store and the saloon, a purveyor of rumors and false hope. "A tragedy what Cole is doing," he would say to a group of anxious farmers, "forcing men to work in these conditions. And for what? So he can sell all that water to the railroad when his spur line comes through. He will not leave a drop for any of you." He would then steer the conversation toward his bank. "A small loan, just to get you through the winter. A special rate. For my neighbors. We have to look out for each other. After all." The town began to fracture. There were those who worked for Cole and were grateful for the wages and Eliza's stew. And there were those who listened to Dugan and saw the Baron as a threat to their very survival. The gossip about Eliza and Nathaniel intensified, fanned by Dugan's sly insinuations. She was his creature, they whispered. A sweet face to distract them while he stole their future. Eliza heard the whispers. They stung, but she held her head high, finding strength in the simple, honest work of her kitchen. The first sign of open warfare came 3 nights later. Jack Crow and 2 of his men, emboldened by Dugan's money and the sheriff's convenient absence, made a run at a small pasture holding a dozen of Nathaniel's prize heifers. It was a test, a probe of his defenses. They were not counting on Deputy Alma Reyes. She had been watching Crow for days, her instincts sharp. When she saw them ride out, she did not hesitate. She rode hard to Willow Creek, her message brief and urgent. Nathaniel, Boyd, and Alma were in the saddle within minutes, thundering out into the darkness. The temporary channel was nearly complete, the water already beginning to trickle through. A fragile victory. Now this, Nathaniel felt a surge of rage at the constant, grinding attrition. The chase led them into the narrow, winding canyons east of the valley. The weather had turned again. A warm wind, a chinook, was sweeping down from the mountains, melting the snow at a terrifying rate. The ground beneath their horses' hooves was a treacherous soup of mud and slush. Waterfalls of melted snow cascaded down the canyon walls, loosening rocks that tumbled down into the darkness. It was a place of chaos, where nature itself had become an enemy. They cornered one of Crow's men when his horse slipped in the mud, but Crow and the other vanished into the labyrinthine passages, the stolen heifers with them. As they were securing their prisoner, a low rumble echoed through the canyon. It grew into a deafening roar. "Rock slide!" Boyd yelled, his voice nearly swallowed by the noise. They spurred their horses, racing away from the sound of crashing boulders and splintering rock. They were alive, but the pursuit was over. Back at the ranch, the Chinook wind and the distant sounds of the rock slide had their own effect. The main herd, thousands of longhorns, panicked. the scent of fear is a wildfire in a herd that size. They began to move, a low, rumbling stampede, not away from the ranch, but blindly, toward the lights of Red Bluff. Eliza saw it first. The ground began to tremble. A sound like distant thunder grew louder. She ran to the edge of the camp, her heart seizing in her chest. It was a river of horns and hide, a terrifying, unstoppable force rolling through the darkness. She did not think. She acted. She grabbed a burning log from the fire pit. "Torch!" She yelled to the small group of older children who often hung around her kitchen. "We need torches. Now!" The children, frightened but trusting her, scrambled to obey. Within minutes, a small, brave band stood with her, their faces illuminated by the flickering, makeshift torches. They formed a line, a fragile barrier of fire and courage against the tide of terrified cattle. "Easy now," Eliza found herself calling out, her voice surprisingly steady. "Hold the line. Just show them the light. Turn them back toward the valley." It was a terrifying, beautiful sight. The shy girl from the Copper Cup, leading a small army of children, holding back thousands of pounds of panic with nothing but fire and will. The cattle saw the line of flames, their fear of the fire momentarily greater than their blind terror. The front of the herd hesitated, slowed, and began to turn, following the path of least resistance back toward the open pastures of the ranch. When Nathaniel, Boyd, and Alma returned, exhausted and mud-spattered, they were met with this incredible scene. The stampede was over, the herd was saved, and standing there, her face smudged with soot, her eyes bright with a fire he had never seen before, was Eliza Hart. He slid from his horse, his whole body aching. He looked at the line of children holding their torches, at the calm, contained order she had pulled from sheer chaos. He had been trying to conquer this land with money and force. She had saved his fortune with a pot of stew and a burning stick. He felt his own carefully constructed walls of self-reliance begin to crack. He was a man who prided himself on controlling everything. Yet, in his absence, this quiet, blushing woman had shown more command than he ever had. The next day, Red Bluff was buzzing. The story of the torch line had spread like wildfire. Some saw it as heroism. Others, spoon-fed Dugan's poison, saw it as further proof that Eliza was in the Baron's pocket, protecting his assets. The division in the town was now a chasm. That evening, Silas Dugan called a town meeting. The church hall was packed, the air thick with tension. Dugan stood at the pulpit, a shepherd tending his flock of fearful sheep. "We have rustlers in our canyons and stampedes at our doorstep," he boomed, his voice echoing in the rafters. "This is what happens when one man puts his own greed above the well-being of a community." Alma stood up, her voice cutting through his rhetoric. "The only reason Jack Crow is a threat is because he has friends in high places. Mayor, friends who supply him with money and, perhaps, even specialized fuse wire." A gasp went through the crowd. Dugan's face paled for a second before his mask of indignation slipped back into place. "That is a baseless accusation. Deputy." Nathaniel was there, standing at the back of the hall. He listened to them argue, to the shouts from the crowd, some defending him, some condemning him. He realized he did not just need to control the water. He needed the people, and he had no idea how to win them. He looked across the room and saw Eliza, standing with a Mr. Wu. She was not looking at him. She was watching the people, her expression full of a sad understanding. Later, in her small office, Alma ignored the noise from the saloon next door. She had a stack of old, dusty ledgers from the town archives. She was not looking for criminal records. She was looking for a map, the original survey of the Red Bluff Valley from 50 years ago. She finally found it, a brittle piece of parchment covered in faded ink. She traced the lines of Willow Creek with her finger, following it up from the valley floor to its source in the hills. And then she saw it, a notation, made in a different hand, a correction to the original survey. It was a legal flaw, a surveyor's error from decades ago. A small, crucial section of the land, right where the creek bubbled up from the ground, was not part of the Willow Creek deed at all. It had been designated, in the precise legal language of the time, as common land, for the use and benefit of all the valley's inhabitants. Nathaniel Cole owned the creek, but he did not own the spring. Alma leaned back in her chair, a slow, determined smile spreading across her face. The water of the region, she whispered to the empty room, is the life of the region, and it belonged to them all. The moon was a ghost, a pale sliver hidden behind a thick veil of clouds. A deep, bone-aching cold had settled over Red Bluff, silencing the streets and driving everyone indoors. Inside the copper cup, the lamps were turned down low, casting long, dancing shadows across the empty tables. The only sounds were the soft crackle of the embers in the stove and the gentle clink of a mug as Eliza washed the last of the day's dishes. The town meeting had left a bitter taste in her mouth. She had seen the town she loved split in two. The faces of her neighbors hardened with suspicion and fear, and she was at the center of it, a pawn in a game she had never asked to play. She dried her hands on her apron and went to check on Martha, who was sleeping fitfully in the back room, her cough a soft, persistent rhythm in the quiet. Eliza felt a familiar pang of fear. The doctor in Cheyenne, the better medicine, it all felt further away than ever. Her own small, burgeoning feelings for the man at the center of the storm felt like a betrayal of that single, vital goal, a distraction she could not afford. She was about to lock the front door when a figure emerged from the darkness and stopped on the boardwalk. It was Nathaniel Cole. He stood there for a long moment, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that seemed to go beyond the physical. He was not the Baron of Willow Creek in that moment, just a man, alone in the cold. He finally stepped forward and pushed the door open. The little bell above it chimed softly, a sound too cheerful for the tension that immediately filled the room. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice low and rough, "I am sorry to disturb you so late." "The shop is closed, sir," she replied, her voice more guarded than she intended. "I know. I am not here for coffee. I came to apologize." She watched him, her heart giving a nervous flutter. He walked further into the room, his gaze sweeping over the simple, clean space. He stopped at the main counter, the very spot where she had refused his coin just days before. "What they were saying in the church tonight, the things they are whispering about you, it is my fault," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "I brought this trouble to your door. I have made you a target in my fight with Dugan, and that was not my right." Eliza did not know what to say. An apology was the last thing she had expected. He reached into his coat and placed a small, heavy leather pouch on the polished wood of the counter. It landed with a soft, definitive thud. The drawstring was open just enough to reveal the unmistakable glint of gold coins. "This is to make up for the trouble," he said. "For the damage to your name, for the business you have probably lost. It is the least I can do." She stared at the bag. It represented an answer to her prayers. It was the doctor from Cheyenne. It was medicine for Martha. It was security. It was a comfortable winter. It was also a transaction. It was payment for her reputation, a price placed on her good name. And it felt like an ending, a neat and tidy settlement that would put them back in their separate worlds, him in his fortress of wealth, and her in her small, respectable life. Her cheeks began to burn, the familiar blush rising. Her hands, resting on the counter, trembled almost imperceptibly, but when she looked up at him, her eyes were clear and direct. She slowly pushed the bag of gold back toward him. "I want to pour you a cup of coffee," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. "Not count your gold." Nathaniel looked from the pouch to her face, a flicker of his earlier confusion returning. He did not understand her. He did not understand a world where a problem like this could not be solved by the simple application of money. She did not wait for his answer. She pulled out a chair from the nearest table, the legs scraping softly against the wood floor. "Please," she said, "sit. The coffee is still warm." He hesitated for a moment. Then, slowly, like a man unaccustomed to accepting invitations, he walked to the table and sat down. Eliza brought over the pot and 2 mugs. She placed the pot on the table between them, a simple, steaming barrier against the cold and the silence. She poured, the dark, fragrant liquid filling the mugs. They sat without speaking for a minute, the warmth of the mugs seeping into their hands. He finally broke the silence. "Why?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Why refuse the money anyone else in this valley would have taken it?" "Because my name is not for sale," she said simply, looking into her cup. "And because it looked to me like you have enough people in your life who say yes to your money. Maybe you need one who will not." A faint, humorless smile touched his lips. "You might be right about that." She risked a glance at him. She saw the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the tension that never seemed to leave his shoulders. "You look tired," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "As tired as the men digging your ditch." He let out a short, surprised laugh. He had not expected that. "I probably am," he admitted. "Sleep has not come easy lately." They talked. He spoke of his childhood, not in a grand house, but in a series of temporary camps along the ever-advancing line of the Union Pacific Railroad. His father had been an engineer, a man who loved the cold, hard logic of steel and steam more than anything else. Nathaniel's lullabies had been the clang of hammers and the shriek of a train whistle. He spoke of a life spent calculating angles, profits, and risks, a world that had taught him to trust numbers and contracts, but not people. She, in turn, told him about Martha, how she had been taken in as an orphan after a fever swept through a wagon train, how Martha had taught her to read, to bake, and to see the good in people, even when it was well hidden. She spoke of the copper cup not as a business, but as a legacy, a sanctuary of warmth that Martha had built, and that she was now determined to protect. He listened, his gaze intent. He had seen her as a strange anomaly, an innocent. Now he was beginning to see her strength, a resilience forged not in boardrooms and banks, but in the quiet, daily struggles of a life lived for someone else. "The loneliness is the worst part of it," he confessed, the words quiet, almost dragged from him, "of being the man at the top of the ledger. You are never sure. You are never sure if people see you or if they just see what you have, if they value your company, or just your account balance." He stared into his now cold coffee, the memory of a past betrayal flickering in his eyes. He had built his walls so high to keep the pain out, but he now realized they had also become a prison. Eliza felt a profound wave of sympathy for him. She saw the boy who grew up with the noise of machines, the young man who had his heart broken, and the man now who was trying to build an empire to fill the empty spaces inside him. "Maybe," she said softly, "you just have not met enough people who prefer coffee to gold." He looked up at her, and in his eyes, she saw a flicker of something new. Not calculation, not assessment, but a raw, unguarded vulnerability, a flicker of hope. The clock on the wall chimed midnight. The spell was broken. "I should go," he said, his voice husky. "I have kept you too long." He stood, and as he did, he winced, instinctively flexing his bandaged wrist. "Is it still paining you?" she asked. "It is stiff," he admitted. "The cold gets into it." "Wait." She went behind the counter and returned with a small square of plain, soft cotton. It was a simple handkerchief, immaculately clean but worn soft from many washings. "Here," she said. "Wrap this around it, under the bandage. It will keep it a little warmer." He looked at the small piece of cloth in her hand. It was an absurdly simple thing. It was worth nothing. And yet it felt like the most valuable thing he had been offered in years. He held out his hand, and she carefully wrapped the cloth around his wrist, her touch gentle, her fingers warm against his skin. For a moment, they stood there, The simple act of care, a silent, powerful bond between them. "Thank you, Eliza," he said, using her first name for the first time. He turned to leave, his eyes falling on the pouch of gold still sitting on the counter. He looked at it, then back at her, and walked out the door without it. He left the gold, but he took the handkerchief. Eliza stood in the quiet of her shop, her heart a whirlwind of emotions. A warmth spread through her chest. A dangerous, thrilling warmth that had nothing to do with the stove, but beneath it was a tremor of fear. She had a sick mother to care for, a life to build. She could not afford to fall for a man who was at war with the whole valley, a man whose life was a magnet for trouble. From her room, Martha had heard the low murmur of their voices. She had not heard the words, but she had heard the tone. It was the sound of two lonely souls finding a moment of peace, and she smiled. Across the street, in the dark window of the bank's upper office, Silas Dugan had seen the Baron enter the Copper Cup, and an hour later, he saw him leave. He did not know what had transpired, but he knew that any connection between those two was a weapon he could use. Cole had a weakness after all, a blushing, soft-hearted weakness. Late that night, long after the lights in the Copper Cup had gone out, a different shadow detached itself from the alleyway. Jack Crow moved with a practiced silence. A thin piece of metal slid into the lock of the storeroom door, and with a soft click, it opened. He slipped inside, pulling the door shut behind him. He lit a small match, the flame tiny in the cramped, dark space. He ignored the sacks of flour and beans. He was looking for one thing. He found it on a high shelf, a small wooden box containing the shop's meager supply of medicines. Inside, nestled in cotton, was a small brown bottle containing a precious few ounces of morphine, the only thing that gave Martha relief on her worst nights. He slipped the bottle into his coat pocket, extinguished the match, and melted back into the night, leaving behind an open lock and a carefully laid trap. The raid came with the first gray light of dawn, a brutal intrusion into the sanctuary of the Copper Cup. The town marshal, a man named Calloway, whose authority came directly from Silas Dugan, slammed the door open without knocking. 2 deputies followed him, their boots heavy on the clean floorboards. Eliza was in the back, checking on Martha. She ran out, her heart leaping into her throat, thinking there had been a fire. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. Calloway unrolled a warrant with a flourish. "We have a report of illicit narcotics being sold from this establishment. We are here to conduct a search." He did not wait for a reply. His men began to overturn things with a casual, practiced violence, pulling bins from under the counter, yanking open cupboards. Eliza stood frozen in disbelief, her mind racing. Narcotics. It made no sense. Of course, it took them less than a minute. One of the deputies, searching the storeroom that Jack Crow had so recently visited, called out, "Found something. Marshal." He emerged holding the small brown bottle of morphine. He held it up for all to see. A trophy. But it was not the bottle Crow had stolen. It was a different one. Larger, nearly full, of a type Eliza had never seen. Crow had not just stolen her supply, he had replaced it, planting false evidence. Eliza gasped. "That is not mine. I have never seen that bottle before." Calloway ignored her, taking the bottle and inspecting the label. Morphine sulfate, a substantial quantity. He turned to Eliza, his eyes cold and triumphant. "Eliza Hart, you are under arrest." Before she could protest further, they had her by the arms. They dragged her from the warmth of her home, out into the raw, muddy street. A crowd was already gathering, drawn by the commotion. She saw their faces in the dim morning light. Some were shocked, some confused, but many were alight with a kind of grim satisfaction. The whispers she had been hearing for days had now been given form. Silas Dugan stood on the boardwalk of the bank, watching the scene unfold. He was not dressed as the mayor, but as a concerned citizen, a pillar of the community forced to witness a sad but necessary duty. "This is a black day for Red Bluff," he announced, his voice carrying across the street. "To think that this was happening right under our noses, this den of vice, masquerading as a coffee shop. Marshal, I insist you hold this woman. No bail. We must make an example of her, for the sake of our children." Eliza felt a wave of despair wash over her. It was a lie, a monstrous, perfectly constructed lie, and the whole town was watching her humiliation. She was alone. Then a horse came pounding down the street and pulled up sharply. Nathaniel Cole swung out of the saddle. His eyes took in the scene in an instant. Eliza, held between two deputies, her face pale and streaked with tears, the smug, righteous look on Dugan's face, the hungry eyes of the crowd. "What is the charge, Marshal?" Nathaniel asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Possession and sale of narcotics," Calloway said, puffing out his chest. "We've found the evidence." "Let her go. I will post her bail." The words were out before he could stop them. The old, familiar solution. Money. Eliza looked at him then, and her eyes were not pleading for rescue. They were pleading for something far more difficult. For faith. "Do not buy my freedom." "Nathaniel," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Believe me." He saw it then. He saw the trap. Dugan did not just want to remove Eliza. He wanted to implicate him, to make him look like a rich man buying his mistress out of trouble, confirming all the rumors. He looked at Eliza's proud, terrified face and remembered their conversation, the feel of the simple cotton handkerchief still wrapped around his wrist beneath his glove. He made a different choice. "She will not need bail. Calloway, because you have no case," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "She will need a lawyer. I am sending for Judge Reed's man from Cheyenne." A murmur went through the crowd. A real lawyer changed things. And in the meantime, a new voice cut in. "You have other things to consider." Deputy Alma Reyes stepped through the crowd, her face set like stone. "I was just examining the storeroom. I found boot prints under the window. They look remarkably similar to a pair I have seen Jack Crow wear. And that bottle of morphine you found. The doctor reported a nearly identical bottle stolen from his dispensary just last night. It is quite a coincidence." Dugan's face tightened. This was not part of his plan. "These are distractions," he snapped. "We have the evidence in our hand." At that exact moment, a low, deep boom echoed from the direction of the valley. The ground beneath their feet trembled. Everyone froze, faces turning toward the sound. A moment of stunned silence. And then it was followed by a growing, angry roar, the sound of 1,000 waterfalls at once. Someone screamed, "The dam?" Chaos erupted. People ran for higher ground. The sound grew louder. A churning, destructive symphony. From his vantage point, Nathaniel could see it, a black torrent of mud, uprooted trees, and icy water pouring through a massive breach in his temporary channel. It was not a flood. It was a liquid avalanche. His ranch, his herd, his entire future in this valley was being washed away. He did not hesitate. He locked eyes with Eliza for a fraction of a second, a silent promise passing between them. Then he, Boyd, and Alma were on their horses, galloping madly toward the disaster. In the ensuing panic, the case against Eliza Hart was forgotten. Alma looked at the flustered marshal. "I have enough to bring Crow in for questioning about that theft. You go deal with this flood. Let her go." Calloway, eager to assert his authority on a less complicated front, shoved Eliza toward the copper cup and ran off, shouting orders no one could hear. Eliza was free, but she did not feel it. She stumbled into the shop and found Martha on the floor, having collapsed from the shock and the strain on her weak heart. With Mr. Wu's help, she got her mother back to bed, her mind a numb haze of fear. Martha was alive, her breathing shallow, but the morphine that gave her comfort on nights like this was gone, stolen. Once Martha was settled, a strange calm descended on Eliza. She could hear the roar of the water, the shouts of men. She looked at her hands. She could not stop the flood. She could not fight Silas Dugan, but she could do something. She could do the one thing she knew how to do. She walked out of the copper cup and into the chaos. The air was filled with a fine, cold spray. A river of black, stinking mud was now flowing where the main road had been. She did not run from it. She ran toward the field where she had set up her kitchen, the one place she knew she could be of use. The scene at the breach was a vision of hell. The water was a churning, freezing monster, eating away at the land, threatening to widen the gap and release the full force of the reservoir. Men were fighting a desperate, losing battle, throwing sandbags and logs into the torrent, only to see them swept away. Nathaniel was in the heart of it, a man possessed. He was caked in mud, his voice raw from shouting. He worked with a fury born of desperation, trying to hold back the ruin of his empire with his bare hands. A massive support timber, weakened by the initial blast, finally gave way with a splintering crack. It swung loose, knocking two men into the churning water and catching Nathaniel in the leg, pulling him down into the icy torrent. The cold was a physical blow, stealing his breath, paralyzing his limbs. He was pulled under, the weight of his clothes and the powerful current dragging him down into the blackness. For a moment, he gave into it, the fight leaving him. Then Boyd's strong hand clamped onto his collar and hauled him, sputtering and half-drowned, back to the muddy bank. He lay there, shivering uncontrollably, the taste of mud and failure in his mouth. He had lost, but a quarter-mile away, a different kind of battle was being won. A single point of light and warmth was growing in the gray, chaotic landscape. Eliza had restarted her fire. The flames leaped up, a defiant beacon in the gloom. People, seeing the smoke, began to gravitate toward it. She organized them, her voice clear and steady. Her earlier fears burned away by the urgency of the moment. She put the men to work building a temporary shelter from the wind and the spray, and the women to work chopping vegetables. Soon, the smell of hot coffee and simmering stew began to push back against the stench of the flood. Her field kitchen was no longer just a place for a hot meal. It was a command center. It was a hospital for the injured. It was a sanctuary for the cold and the frightened. It was the heart of the resistance, and it beat with a steady, determined rhythm. Nathaniel, wrapped in a dozen dry blankets by the fire, watched her. He saw her moving through the crowd. A word of comfort here, a bowl of soup there, a bandage for an injured hand. He had tried to solve his problems by building a wall of earth and timber. She was saving his world by building a community. As the afternoon wore on, a rider, his face pale with alarm, galloped into the camp. He was looking for Eliza. "It is your mother," he gasped, his horse heaving for breath. She collapsed again. "The doctor says it is bad." Eliza's face went white. The dam, the flood, the fight for the valley, it all vanished. In that moment, there was only Martha. She untied her apron, her movements suddenly frantic. She gave a few quick instructions to the women around her and then, without a backward glance at Nathaniel, she ran, her feet slipping in the mud, back toward the town, back toward the only battle that truly mattered. The information came from one of Crow's own men, captured in the canyon, his loyalty washed away by fear and a broken leg. Alma Reyes listened, her face impassive. As he laid out the plan, Jack Crow was finished with testing the waters. Tonight, he was going to burn the heart out of Nathaniel Cole's operation The Breeding Barns, where the future of the Willow Creek herd was sheltered. It was not just rustling anymore. It was annihilation. They gathered in the main ranch house, the air thick with the smell of wet wool and brewing coffee. Nathaniel, Boyd, Alma, and a dozen deputized ranchers, their faces grim in the lantern light. Outside, the wind howled, a mournful, relentless sound. "He will come from the east, using the bluffs as cover," Alma said, tracing a line on a crude map of the ranch. "We can set up here and here, catch them in a crossfire, but we need to draw them into the open, away from the barns. We need a lure." All eyes turned to Nathaniel. It was his ranch, his fight. He looked at the map, his mind a cold engine of calculation, weighing assets and risks. A wagon, a decoy fire. No, a quiet voice said. Everyone turned. Eliza stood in the doorway, her hands clasped in front of her. She had returned from town hours ago, her face a pale mask of grief and resolve. Martha was stable, for now, but the doctor had been blunt. Without proper care, she did not have long. That knowledge had not broken Eliza. It had forged her. "Use me," she said, her voice steady. "Use my coffee cart. I will take it to the edge of the clearing, by the old cottonwood. I will light a lantern. Make some noise. They will think it is a lone night watchman, an easy target. It will pull them into your trap." Nathaniel was on his feet instantly. "Absolutely not. It is too dangerous." She met his gaze, and for the first time there was no blush, no hint of the shy girl from the copper cup. There was only a woman who had made a decision. "You are fighting for your cattle, for your land. I am fighting for my mother. For this town. Let me do this. I cannot shoot a gun, but I can make coffee. Let me use my strength, not yours." Alma looked from Eliza to Nathaniel, her sharp eyes assessing the plan. "It is a good plan. Cole, it is unexpected. They will not be looking for a coffee cart." He looked at Eliza, at the fierce determination in her eyes, and he saw the folly of his objection. He had been trying to protect her, to keep her separate from his violent world. But her world had already been invaded. She was not asking for protection. She was offering to stand with him on the front line. The fear he felt for her was a physical thing, a cold knot in his stomach. But he nodded slowly. "All right, but Boyd and I will be the closest. The instant you see them, you douse that lantern and get down." An hour later, the small coffee cart stood alone in the whipping wind, a tiny, fragile island in a sea of darkness. A single lantern hanging from its canvas roof cast a circle of brave, flickering light. Inside, Eliza worked with deliberate calm, the familiar, comforting sounds of a grinder and the clink of tin cups a strange counterpoint to the howling wind. She was terrified, her hands shaking so badly she could barely pour the beans. But she thought of Martha's shallow breathing, of Dugan's smug face in the street, and she found a core of hard, cold anger to cling to. They came, as predicted, like wolves from the shadows. 4 riders, moving low and fast. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. She reached for the lantern, her fingers trembling. But before she could act, another figure emerged from the darkness. He was on foot, leading a horse. It was Silas Dugan. He stopped beside Jack Crow, his voice a low, commanding hiss that carried on the wind. "Forget the cattle, you fool. I want it all burned, the barns, the hay stores, everything. I want this place to be a pile of ash by morning. It needs to look like a tragic accident." A shot rang out, not from the ambushers, but from the darkness behind Dugan. Alma's signal. Instantly, the night exploded in a chaos of muzzle flashes and the sharp crack of rifles. The deputized ranchers opened fire from their hidden positions. One of Crow's men tumbled from his saddle. Another screamed and clutched his arm. Crow and his remaining men scrambled for cover, firing blindly into the darkness. In the confusion, Dugan pulled a pistol, his face a mask of fury. This was not the clean surgical strike he had planned. Nathaniel broke from his position, his focus not on the rustlers, but on the man who had orchestrated it all. He met Dugan in the open space between the cart and the barns, the wind tearing at their coats. "This is over, Dugan." Nathaniel's voice was a low growl. "You buy land. You do not buy people." Dugan laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Everything has a price. Cole, you, of all people, should know that." He gestured with his pistol toward the coffee cart, where Eliza was crouched, her face illuminated by the swaying lantern. "Even your blushing virgin." He strode toward her, pulling a thick envelope from his coat pocket. He threw it onto the cart, where it landed next to the coffee grinder. A stack of railroad bonds, enough to bring 12 doctors from Cheyenne, enough to give your mother the best care in the territory. Take it and be gone from this valley by morning. Eliza slowly stood up. The battle raged around her, a whirlwind of noise and fear. But in the small circle of lantern light, the world seemed to slow down. She looked at the envelope, at the promise of everything she had ever wanted. She saw a future where Martha was comfortable, where she did not have to worry about the price of medicine. Then she looked at Dugan's face, at his cold, possessive eyes, and she saw the true cost. She pushed the envelope away with the tip of her finger. Her face was flushed, not with shyness, but with a righteous, burning anger. "I will ask for a cup of coffee for everyone after tonight," she said, her voice ringing out, clear and strong. "I will not ask for your gold." Enraged by her defiance, Jack Crow lunged from the shadows, his gun leveled directly at her. "No, you will not!" he snarled. It happened faster than thought. Nathaniel moved, throwing himself in front of Eliza, a human shield against the threat. The world erupted in a flash of fire and a deafening roar next to his ear. A searing, white-hot pain tore through his left shoulder. He staggered back, the force of the impact spinning him around. But he stayed on his feet, his body still between Eliza and the gun. Another shot cracked through the night, this one from Alma's rifle. Jack Crow cried out, dropping his pistol as the bullet tore through his shoulder. He collapsed to the ground, wounded but alive. The fight was over. The remaining rustler surrendered. The deputized ranchers emerged from the darkness, their rifles trained on the prisoners. They had all seen it. They had seen Dugan give the order to burn the barns. They had seen him try to buy Eliza. They had seen Nathaniel Cole take a bullet for her. The spell of Dugan's power, woven from whispers and lies, was broken by the undeniable truth of what they had witnessed with their own eyes. Alma cuffed a groaning Jack Crow, while Boyd rushed to Nathaniel's side, ripping his coat open to inspect the wound. It was a deep graze, bleeding freely, but the bullet had passed through. He would live. Eliza was there an instant later, her hands pressing a clean cloth from her cart against the wound, her face a storm of fear and relief. Dugan stood frozen, his face ashen. He had lost. He looked at the faces of the ranchers, men who had sat in his bank, men he had controlled with debt and empty promises. He saw no fear in their eyes now, only contempt. Alma walked toward him, her pistol held steady. "Silas Dugan, you are under arrest for conspiracy, arson, and attempted murder." Crow, clutching his shattered shoulder, spat a mouthful of blood onto the ground. "Ask him," he rasped, looking at Dugan with pure hatred. "Ask him who paid me to plant that dynamite. Ask him who gave me the black viper fuse." Alma did not need to ask, as she looked at Dugan, a cold, triumphant light in her eyes. "I will be paying a visit to your bank tonight, Mayor. I'm sure I will find your bookkeeping fascinating." She knew, with absolute certainty, that this was the end. The real evidence, the black ledger of Dugan's crimes, was waiting for her. Justice in Red Bluff had not come from a judge or a distant law. It had started with a choice, with a woman who refused to sell herself, even for the person she loved most. Red Bluff had no courthouse, so justice was dispensed in the house of God. The church was packed, every pew filled, the air thick with the scent of damp wool and anxious humanity. The Reverend stood before them, his Bible open, but he did not preach fire and brimstone. He spoke of accountability, of a community's duty to mend what has been broken, and of the simple, unassailable truth that a man's wealth is measured not by the gold in his vault, but by the integrity of his word. Silas Dugan sat in the front pew, flanked by 2 armed deputies from the next county, a federal marshal on his way. His tailored suit was immaculate, but it could not hide the ruin in his eyes. He was a king in a captured castle, surrounded by the subjects who had finally seen through his facade. The lawyer from Cheyenne, a sharp man named Reed, laid out the case with methodical precision. But the true weight of the evidence came from Deputy Alma Reyes. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She simply opened the black ledger she had taken from Dugan's bank, the one hidden beneath a false floorboard in his office. One by one, she read the entries aloud. Loans granted at impossible interest rates to ranchers on the brink of failure. Payments made to Jack Crow and his men, recorded in a simple, damning code. Notes detailing the purchase of explosives. A meticulous record of a man's greed, written in his own hand. With every word, another stone was removed from the foundation of Dugan's power, until there was nothing left but the pathetic, grasping man himself. When she was finished, a profound silence filled the church. The town was not just hearing about crimes, they were hearing the secret history of their own suffering. Dugan was led away in irons, his face a mask of cold fury, not a shred of remorse in his gaze. He would face a federal judge, his reign over Red Bluff finished forever. In the emotional vacuum that followed, the town turned to the man who had faced Dugan down. John Miller, a rancher whose property bordered Willow Creek, stood up, his hat in his hands. "Mr. Cole," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "You took a bullet for this town. You broke the man who was breaking us. That water at Willow Creek, it is yours. We all agree. We want you to have it. Take it. You have earned it." A murmur of assent went through the crowd. It was a complete reversal, an offering of fealty. They were ready to trade one baron for another, a benevolent one this time. Nathaniel felt the familiar pull of that power, the simple, clean authority he had always sought. He had won. He could control the water, the land, the entire valley. But as he stood to speak, he looked over at Eliza. She was sitting in a pew near the back, her hands folded in her lap. She was not looking at him with adoration. She was looking at him with a quiet, hopeful expectation. She had shown him a different kind of strength, a power that did not come from control, but from connection. He thought of the mended dam, of the men working side by side, of her torch against the stampede. He cleared his throat. "Thank you, John. Thank you all. But I cannot accept." He paused, letting the weight of his refusal settle in the room. "That water does not belong to me any more than it belonged to Silas Dugan. It belongs to the valley." He then laid out a new plan, speaking with a clarity that surprised even himself. The words were his, but the spirit behind them was Eliza's. He proposed that the profits from his first big cattle drive, combined with whatever assets were seized from Dugan, would be used to establish a community water fund, ensuring every ranch had what it needed to survive the dry seasons. Furthermore, he suggested they form a town credit cooperative, a small bank owned by its members, offering fair loans and a chance to build a future free from predatory lenders. And, he concluded, his gaze finding Alma, "I can think of no one better to oversee that cooperative's charter than Deputy Reyes, a woman who has proven she values justice far more than profit." The town was stunned into silence. Then a slow, rolling wave of applause began, building until the rafters of the old church rang with it. It was not the cheer for a conqueror. It was the grateful roar for a leader. Eliza watched him, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. He was not just the richest man in the valley anymore. He was becoming its best. In the weeks that followed, a fragile spring seemed to arrive early in Red Bluff. The work was hard, but it was shared. Men who had been on opposite sides of the water dispute now worked shoulder to shoulder, repairing the breach in the dam. When the final timbers were in place and the last sandbag was laid, the water of Willow Creek began to flow again. No longer a black, muddy torrent, but a clear, life-giving stream. The mended dam stood as a rugged, imperfect monument to their new beginning. With the first withdrawal from the community fund, Eliza was able to bring the doctor from Cheyenne to Red Bluff. He examined Martha, prescribed new medicine, and, for the first time in years, gave Eliza a concrete, medical hope. In the evenings, the copper cup was full again, the laughter louder, the arguments friendlier. In the corner, Mr. Wu had started a small class, teaching the town's widows how to use sewing machines, their hands, once idle with grief, now busy with the creation of new things. One afternoon, the mail rider brought a letter to the ranch for Nathaniel. It was on expensive, perfumed stationery, the handwriting an elegant, familiar script. It was from his former fiancée, the woman who had left him for a richer man all those years ago. She had read about his heroic exploits in the Eastern papers, about the downfall of a corrupt tyrant and the rise of a cattle baron who had saved a town. She wrote of her regret, of her youthful foolishness, of her hope that he might find it in his heart to forgive her. She was coming west, she said, and hoped they might see each other. Nathaniel read the letter and felt nothing, a faint, ghostly echo of an old hurt, but no anger, no longing. The woman who wrote those words and the man she was writing to were strangers to him now. He tossed the letter onto his desk, a relic from a buried life, and went back to work. Later that week, Martha, feeling stronger than she had in months, decided to tidy up Nathaniel's ranch house office while he was out on the range. She saw the letter, and mistaking it for a piece of trash, tucked it into a book she was borrowing, intending to use it as a bookmark. A few days later, Eliza found the letter. It had fallen from the pages of the book onto the floor of the copper cup. She recognized the handwriting was not Nathaniel's, and her heart gave a small, uncertain lurch. Curiosity, mixed with a faint tremor of insecurity, made her unfold it. She read the elegant, flowing words, the talk of regret and second chances. She read of a woman from his past, a woman of wealth and society, a world away from her own simple life. The Eliza of a month ago would have been devastated. Her insecurities would have bloomed, her fears confirmed. She would have seen herself as a temporary comfort, a simple country girl soon to be discarded for a woman of his own class. But as she stood there in the quiet of her cafe, holding the ghost of his past in her hands, she felt no jealousy. She simply folded the letter and put it away. She did not need to confront him. She did not need his reassurances. Her trust in him was not built on his words or his promises. It was built on the memory of him standing between her and a gun. It was built on the sight of him giving up a fortune in water rights for the good of his neighbors. It was built on the feel of his calloused hand in hers as they walked by the newly repaired dam the evening before. She believed in what he did, not in what he said or what he had been. That night, he came into the cafe, his shoulders still bandaged, a smudge of mud on his cheek. He looked tired and content. "I spent all afternoon trying to make a decent pot of coffee on the range," he said with a wry grin. "Boyd says it is still terrible." Eliza laughed, a warm, genuine sound. "Your coffee-making skills are a threat to the entire valley. Mr. Cole, it is a good thing you have other talents." Their eyes met over the counter, and in that shared, easy moment, they both knew that the foundation of their trust was now as solid and dependable as the mended earth of the dam, capable of holding back any flood the world might send their way. The spring that came to Red Bluff Valley was not a gentle thing. It was a boisterous, chaotic explosion of life. The high plains, brown and dormant, flushed an almost violent green overnight. The newly flowing Willow Creek, no longer a sluggish trickle, ran high and clear, its banks crowded with wildflowers. The air, once sharp with the promise of snow, was now thick with the scent of damp earth and cottonwood blossoms. It was a season of renewal, and the valley, like the land itself, was being reborn. At the heart of this rebirth, nestled in a grove of trees by the stream, stood a new building. It was not a bank or a saloon or a jailhouse. It was a kitchen, built with timber from Nathaniel's land and labor from the ranchers he had once fought. It was a simple, sturdy structure with a wide porch and a large stone hearth. It was officially the Willow Creek Community Hall, but everyone called it Eliza's Kitchen. It was a place for town meetings, for Sunday socials, and for any family who needed a warm place to celebrate a birth or mourn a loss. Today was its inauguration, and the entire valley was there. The sound of laughter and conversation drifted on the warm air, mingling with the sizzle of beef roasting on an open pit. Children chased each other through the new grass, their shouts as bright as the sunshine. Alma Reyes stood talking with a group of ranchers, not as a deputy, but as the head of their new credit cooperative, her ledger book filled with fair terms and second chances. Mr. Wu presided over a long table laden with food, his face beaming with pride. Martha, bundled in a warm shawl but with a healthy color in her cheeks for the first time in years, sat in a comfortable chair on the porch, a queen overseeing her happy court. Eliza moved through the crowd, a coffee pot in her hand, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. She was no longer just the girl from the copper cup. She was the thread that had helped stitch this frayed community back together. She saw the faces of the men she had fed when they were digging the channel, the women she had comforted during the flood. They were not patrons or strangers. They were her people. Nathaniel stood near the new building, his arm no longer in a sling, though the shoulder was still stiff. He watched her, a quiet, unreadable expression on his face. He was a different man from the one who had first ridden into this valley. The hard, calculating edges had been worn away, softened by the relentless friction of community, of hardship, of care. He had learned the difficult arithmetic of the heart, a ledger where giving away power resulted in a net gain, and where the most valuable assets could not be counted in dollars. As the afternoon sun began to dip toward the mountains, casting long, golden shadows across the valley, Nathaniel stepped onto the porch of the new kitchen. He held something in his hands, not a pouch of gold or a legal document, but a simple, dented tin coffee pot, the very one she had brought out to the dam site on that blizzardy morning. A hush fell over the crowd. He did not raise his voice to a shout. He spoke in the quiet, steady tone of a man who was sure of his words. "I came to this valley to buy a piece of land," he began, his gray eyes finding Eliza's in the crowd. "I bought this ranch for the water, for a path to the railroad. I bought it for reasons of profit and control. I did not buy it for love." He paused, and in the silence, you could hear the lowing of distant cattle and the gentle murmur of the creek. "But this valley, and the people in it, have taught me something." He looked directly at Eliza now, and his voice was filled with a raw, unvarnished sincerity. "I have been taught that the most important things in this world cannot be bought. They cannot be owned or controlled. They can only be earned, or, if you are very lucky, you can simply ask for a chance." He set the coffee pot down on a small table in front of her. It sat there between them, a humble, potent symbol of their entire story. "Eliza Hart," he said, his voice dropping, becoming a private question in a public space, "will you pour me a cup of coffee every morning?" Eliza felt the familiar blush rise, a wave of heat from her chest to her cheeks. But this time, it was not a blush of shyness or embarrassment. It was the color of a heart overflowing. The entire town held its breath, watching. She looked at the coffee pot, then at the man who had offered it, a man who had faced down gunmen and floods, but who now stood before her with all his defenses down, his hope held out like an open hand. She stepped forward, her hand resting on the pot's worn handle. "Coffee, I can do," she said, her voice clear and bright, a smile breaking through. "The gold, you can keep." For a moment, there was silence, and then the valley erupted. A great, joyous cheer went up from the crowd. Men threw their hats in the air, women laughed and cried at the same time. Boyd let out a whoop that sent a nearby horse skittering. In the midst of the happy chaos, Nathaniel stepped forward and wrapped his arms around Eliza. It was not a passionate kiss for the crowd, but a quiet, private embrace. He held her as if she were the single, solid point in a spinning world, and she leaned into him, her face buried in the rough wool of his coat, feeling, for the first time in her life, completely and utterly home. The sun set, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. A single weeping willow tree, the namesake of the ranch, trailed its branches in the clear, flowing water of the creek. The lowing of the cattle was a peaceful evening song, and from far down the valley, the lonely, hopeful whistle of a train echoed in the twilight. The West was still a wild and unforgiving land, but here, in this small pocket of the world, two hearts had found a place to anchor, a place to build. Later, as they stood together on the porch, watching the last of the guests depart, Nathaniel confessed, his voice a low rumble near her ear. "I have been practicing for a month, on my own, trying to learn how to make a decent cup." Eliza pulled back to look at him, her eyes dancing with amusement in the lantern light. And he grinned, a real, unburdened grin that transformed his whole face. "And Boyd still says it is terrible." Eliza laughed, a sound as clear and welcome as the creek itself. "You can buy an entire valley, Nathaniel Cole. You can face down rustlers and floods, but conquering my coffee pot, well, that is just going to have to take you a lifetime of learning." Thank you for listening to our story. We invite you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video. And support us further by pressing the hype button so this story in the video can be heard by more people.